Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, it's part 5 of our Toys and Joys dump truck and pup trailer build. Well, we kind of finished up on a cliffhanger last week and we were almost done that drop-down axle assembly. So that's what we're going to start off with this week. We're going to get that finished and then I think we're going to get into some assembly. Well, the next pieces that we're going to put on will be these drop-down axle supports, and we can see them right here. It's a little deceiving how they go if you're not familiar with reading these plans, but they'll go tight up to the inside edge here of both of our hinges. So guys, this is not a difficult piece to install. I'll take my 2-inch square, we'll place it up inside here just like this. And once we get that square in place, we'll apply a little bit of glue and we'll butt this piece right up to the edge of the square and to the bottom edge of our drop-down axle hinge. And that will be it for that piece. We can repeat the process on the opposite side and clean up your squeeze out and let those pieces completely set up. Now, before we glue on the last 2 parts, we're just going to carefully go around and give this a very light sanding. The light sanding, guys, is not to remove any rough edges. You should have already sanded those off. It's to remove any raised grain that the water from cleaning up the squeeze out may have created. So we can just clean it up, being careful not to take away any of the pieces, sharp edges, or any of its shape or size. And then we can glue on our last 2 pieces. And our last 2 pieces will be these drop-down axle spacers that we turn down. So we're going to put, just like we did before, a little bit of glue on the end of each axle. And we're going to use that brass pin or a drill bit if you don't have a brass pin, whatever you need to use. But we're going to get these axle pins, or these axle spacers rather, glued onto our axles to complete the assembly. And as long as you take your time and take it one step at a time, step by step, you end up with something that looks like this, guys. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this is without a doubt a challenging piece. This one thing here took over 6 hours to make, so it's not like it's a quick process. So take your time, guys, and enjoy it. So the next piece that I want to make are going to be these fuel tank mounts. Now, there's a couple ways you could do this. You could just photocopy this 4 times and cut them out if you want. For me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually mark this out on a piece of hardboard and cut it out, and I'm going to make a template. Well, one of the good things about making a template is that you can test it for fit, and I like the way that fits. That fits great. Okay, so what we can do now at this point is I'm going to cut some pieces of stock, 3/16 of an inch thick, 1/2 inch by 1 1/4 inch. We can use our template to trace things out, and then I'm just going to cut them at the scroll saw. The important part are these square edges, and that will all be done with the small parts cutting jig over at the table saw. So that's the important part. This arc and this 45 here, you know, if it's a little off, you're never going to see it. It's underneath the model. So either way, let's get these cut. Well guys, one of the pieces that I've neglected to mention was the fuel tank spacers. If I'm going to neglect a piece, this is the one to do because it's extremely simple. 3/16 of an inch thick, 1/2 inch wide, and 1 3/8 of an inch long. Simple cuts on the table, ripping to the width, and then cross-cutting your small parts jig or however you're comfortable to get your 1 3/8. So we're going to start the assembly of this frame, and this is where we're going to start. We're going to start with our fuel tank holders. So we have our straight edge here to give us a nice vertical 90-degree reference point on our build from our assembly board to that steel straight edge. And we're just going to add a little bit of glue to each end of our spacer We're going to put it in place against our straight edge, and we're going to add our brackets, our fuel tank brackets that we cut. And as long as you have your pieces pushed right back to the steel straight edge, you should get a perfect glue up. Now guys, I'm going to clean out the squeeze out, but one thing I will warn you is it's really a good idea to wipe away that squeeze out from your steel straight edge as soon as you can to avoid it rusting. I usually let it sit there for just a couple minutes and then you can scrape it away if you like. But we're going to get the other one assembled and then we'll put those aside and let them dry up. So we now want to put together our rear spring assembly. So we have our 2 rear spring pieces and 1 of our frame spacers. And we're just going to put it up against our steel edge. We'll apply a little bit of glue here on the end of each of our rear springs and slide it into place. And we're going to use just a couple of setup blocks, or you can use a square or whatever you like to hold it in place, push them into where they're supposed to go to make sure that both of your edges on the sides line up properly. Well, we're now going to take our hitch mount and mount it to one of our frame spacers. Guys, these are things that you can do before you actually start gluing the frame together that'll help with your assembly. It can be a little awkward to mount these at a later time. So we can just mount these 2 pieces together. Again, we're going to use our straight edge, and we will use a couple of setup blocks just to make sure that we have the alignment on these pieces. And we'll just set that in place. And again, we're going to let this completely dry up. Well, we're now going to put 1/2 of the frame together. Guys, there is a procedure here that will help you. You just need to know what it is. So what I've done is any component that goes in between our 2 frame pieces, I have them ready to go. Things like our hitch mount and this rear spring, that sort of thing. We have our exhaust holder. You need to have a flat surface, which we have here. We need our reference point, which is our flat steel edge. And at the back here, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but I have a square mounted to that steel edge so that it will help me align the rear piece. I don't have to mess around too much with that. I also have a square mounted right here that is going to be for this exhaust now. Now the reason for that is simple, really. We're kind of building this upside down because we have pieces that protrude like this hitch holder. So we're going to place some glue on here, put it up against the square, and glue it in place. We have the square here and the square edge here, so we know that this is going to be nice and straight and perfect. No problem. I've placed lines on the inside of our frame pieces here to help me align the other pieces. So we have this rear spring, we have the line there, and we can glue that and push it in place, and that's fine. Again, our spacer here, this can get glued in place and sat right there, not a problem. But this one, this little guy right here, which is for our exhaust, this doesn't stick up, or stick down, I guess, through the bottom. We're upside down. This sticks up through the top. So from the bottom of our frame, it's actually, see, I'm a little too close to my assembly board here, so I'm gonna have to move that back square. But it's actually 5/16 of an inch above our frame section. So I have a 5/16 inch spacer, and when I glue this in place, I'm going to get some glue on there, hold it against this square that I have clamped to the frame in the position that this goes, and I can use my 5/16 inch spacer to make sure that it's at the right position. Once you get all that stuff in place, guys, let this stuff dry up. Don't mess with it. Let it dry, and then we can move on to the next step, which will be adding the front spacer and the opposite side of our frame. Now guys, if you're looking for any of these dimensions on our drawing number 2, I believe it is, in the assembly drawing, you're not going to find them. You actually want to go to page 9 and you'll see a 1-to-1 scale drawing here of our model. And you can see that our spacers are here, and you will have to scale off the drawing. But I did find a little bit of a discrepancy. So let me show you this, something you may want to check on your plans. Well, if we measure or we scale off from the very front, this is our very front frame spacer, we'll measure from there and we will take the measurement all the way back to this here. This is our rear spring. So if we take a measurement on that, it's 15 7/16. I've written here on the plans, they're my plans. Why not write on them and make them easier for yourself? But yet, if I measure back to this piece right here, which is another frame spacer, I actually get 9 5/32. Guys, I'm going to tell you from experience, unless it's a drill bit size, Toys and Joys don't work in 30 of an inch. It just doesn't happen. It's usually 16th. I don't think I've ever seen a plan that has a 32nd of an inch in a dimension for a piece. A drill bit, yes, 5/32 drill bit, no problem, but not a dimension for a piece. Every dimension is a 16th. So there's something not right here. Maybe it's lost it in the print. So if I move it up, just like this, to this hole, which is the hole on our frame, this hole here also measures to the center in 32 of an inch. However, we know that from page 2, that hole is actually at 8.5 inches. So what I've done is I've shifted my ruler over so that the 8.5 lines up with the center of that hole in the frame. I've basically shifted it to be a 32nd of an inch to the left, and then I can get my measurement for this piece here and for my exhaust pipe connector, and it turns out to be 9 3/16. And if we look at the exhaust pipe connector, that is 7 3/16. But if I go from the front of the frame, I'm actually getting 7 5/32. So will it make a difference for a 32nd of an inch? It is possible, because it connects here to the front of our cab. Everything along the way connects. So if this is out, this may not make too much of a difference for a 32nd of an inch, but this might and this might. Hard to say. So check your plans for accuracy, and remember, when it comes to Toys and Joys, it's pretty rare to see a measurement that has a 32nd of an inch. Usually nothing is smaller than a 16th. I've glued in my front frame spacer just using a little 2-inch square. I've just supported this off of the edge of our assembly board, sat my square here on the edge, and glued it in place. Now guys, here is the thing. You'll want to make sure at this point that every single piece on your model is square. So get a little square here and get inside, measure from the frame to your piece, making sure that it is square along the way. And as long as you had proper cuts from the get-go, everything should be perfectly square. You shouldn't have a problem. And as long as you're happy with that, you can then carry on with gluing on the other side of the frame, but not until this is dry. Let this dry, because when you clamp the whole frame together now, you don't want things to shift. We don't have any clamping pressure on this. We don't really need any. We've pushed it in there really well. We have also verified our measurements. So you want to just check it. So we're going to check this first one here, 7 3/16. The next one, 9 3/16, etc., all the way along. Make sure your pieces are in the right place. Prior to the wood glue setting, you can still snap one of these off if you need to. Give it a light sanding and you can re-glue it again in a different place. But if you let it set too long, you're never going to repair it. So we're going to leave this for now, And then when we get back to it, once this is all dried, we're going to apply glue to each one of these pieces here. Carefully line it up against our straight edge, being careful not to break off our exhaust mount because it will sit like this and you will snap that off. And just glue it and clamp it together, guys. Clean up the squeeze out and let it be. Just let it sit. If you have anything that has a little rough edge there from the water of cleaning up the squeeze out, give it a very light sanding, and that should be your frame at this point anyway, assembled. Okay, so if you're happy with the way your frame looks, it's now time to mount our fuel tank brackets. So if we scale here off drawing number 9, you will find that the fuel tanks are mounted 4 7/8 of an inch back from the front edge of our frame. So we're just going to place a little mark here, and we can take both of our fuel tank mounts and mount them to the top, just like that, of our main frame. We'll glue them in place, and just like everything else, guys, please let it dry up. Now, while we're waiting for the frame to dry up, we're going to glue our front leaf spring assembly up. So we have our 2-inch spacers here that we made earlier. Guys, just use a square against a steel edge and make sure that the whole assembly goes together squarely. I have this spacer block not because I need the space, but because this will slide under the square otherwise. So it's just a flat surface for me to glue up to. So I'm just going to put a little dab of glue here. You don't need a lot for this. Up against our spacer, and then put our leaf spring in the corner and press it in place, making sure that your spacer and your leaf spring are up against both the metal straight edge and up against the square and the spacer block here. So we're going to do that all the way around to get a nice square assembly, and then we can let that dry up as well. Well, we have our frame now sitting on top of a couple of our sanding blocks. This will just help it to keep it from sliding around, and it raises it up enough so that we're not going to damage our exhaust holder. So on our drawing, we can see that our front bumper is actually down from the top of our frame. And if we measure that distance is 3/8 of an inch. So I have a 3/8 inch setup block here. We can sit this in place. You can see that this is a pretty snug fit. Just like that. And we can glue this in place with our 3/8 inch space at the top. Now, the reason that we glued our bumper on at this point instead of waiting is because we need the reference of the bumper to mount our front spring assembly that we just put together. And the drawing here shows it just behind. I've measured that distance, and that distance is 1/8 of an inch. So all I'm going to do is put a spacer in here, a 1/8 of an inch setup block, just like this. One here. I have these smaller ones that work really well. Another one here. And we will sit this up against those spacer blocks. Make sure that it's centered here on our frame, nice and squarely. And then we'll glue those in place. Well, I now want to mount our front axle to our leaf spring assembly. Now, there's a couple ways that you can go about it. You can measure it and measure it and measure it to make sure that it's centered on the length of your leaf springs and left to right on your assembly. Or, as long as you measured properly and did accurate cuts, you can do this the easy way. This axle is 4 1/16 inch wide. This leaf spring assembly is 2 inches wide. If I subtract the 2 inches from the 4 1/16, that leaves me 2 1/16, which means that if I want this centered, I'm going to need 1 1/32 on both sides. So, I've taken some setup blocks. They total 1 1/32 of an inch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to place them here on my leaf spring, kind of at the back here, and I'm going to clamp them in place. Now, if we look at our drawing, the distance from the back edge of our bumper to the front edge of our axle, that distance is 1 7/8 of an inch. So all you need to do is get setup blocks that are the equivalent of 1 7/8. And watch this. Put this here, glue this in place here. Make sure your blocks are straight. Once you have that where you like it and it's kind of semi set up, it doesn't have to be totally set, but then you can get your setup blocks out of here. I'll try not to move it for this demonstration. And check that out. It is centered front to back and side to side with very little effort. Now, it's not glued yet, but you know from the demonstration, you can see from the demonstration how well that worked. So let's get this axle glued in place. And while we're at it, we can glue in our front axle bracket and our 4 front leaf spring supports. Well, I now want to glue the tanks in. So guys, do a dry fit here. And depending on how tight the tolerances are for your turning, or if you use dowels to make these tanks, depending on how tight those tolerances are, you may need to do some adjustments. And there's nothing wrong with that. I actually had to shave down the back edge here of one of our brackets just to make it fit a little bit better. It was just a little too tight for my liking, and it was putting too much pressure on those brackets. You just want to pay attention, guys, because there's still a couple pieces to add onto these tanks, being the steps. You want to make sure that you're not putting your gas cap or your diesel cap in such a way so that it will interfere with where those steps are going to go. So make sure that you're angling that cap out a little bit like they show in the drawing here. And on the right hand side, now that the tanks are in place, we can glue our battery box 13/16 of an inch back from the back end of our tank. Well, we're now going to install our drop down axle mounts, and in our second spacer from the front, our frame spacer, these drop down brackets get mounted tight to the back end of that bracket and tight to the bottom, it's hard to show this here, to the bottom of the frame. Now, if your cuts are accurate, there's no need for a square. It can only sit one way. So we can get these glued in, and then we're going to look at possibly installing the drop-down axle. And unfortunately, guys, that's all the time that we have for this week. A lot of time taken up this week on assembly and showing methods of layout on the frame, methods of getting things square, methods of spacing out the different pieces to get them centered properly or to get them the proper distance. Also, a little bit of a discrepancy there on the prints, where we were out by that 1/32 of an inch. Now, whether that was from reprints or a mistake on the prints, I don't know. That can happen. The more you print things, the more it distorts. So it's not out of the question that it could be a recopy and distortion thing. But no matter how you look at it, we caught it and we're good. We're good to go. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this so far. It's a little more intense than I thought it was going to be, but I'm enjoying the process so far. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We have a fantastic audience base here, and I'm hoping that you're going to consider becoming a part of it. Guys, I hope you're enjoying the build series up till now. Part 5 parts under our belt. I hope that you're giving this a try in your own shop, that you have your own set of plans, and that you're giving this a try and, working along with me. But more importantly, guys, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.